Welcome to another episode of Grasshopper and the Ant. In this episode, we'll be talking a little bit about Hinduism and Hindutva. To talk about it, we are joined by Joel Bordeaux. Joel is a visiting scholar at Matto Center for India Studies, Stony Brook University. He is a specialist in Bengali Shakta traditions, and he's also interested in sacrifice, ritual magic, literary exegesis, and Hindu-Buddhist interactions. Welcome to the podcast, Joel.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so the first question, the most basic questions I generally have is how do we distinguish between Hinduism and Hindutva, and what is that the differentiating factors that we can say that okay, this is Hinduism, or this is Hindutva.
Right. So that is a very complex question, as I'm sure you know. I think scholars at this point are still debating, and have been for a while, exactly how to define Hinduism. But Hindutva is a somewhat easier lift there. So, I think we can say that Hindutva, generally speaking, we're talking about a project, a political project, more so than a religious formation, which is how we would tend to think of Hinduism. And to that, I would add a third category, actually, which I think is, Hindu, which we have to think of as a potentially distinguishable thing there. So we'll circle back to that in a second. But Hindutva, if we go with the, Savarkar's definition anyway, as not the first person to use the term, but the most famous kind of foundational figure, he's talking about a project that says, that for him, and mind you, he was not a particularly religious person, but Savarkar says that, Hindu is a person who regards India as the fatherland and as a holy land. And that's it for him. So, one striking thing about that, it's a definition that's essentially meant to exclude people like basically like Christians and Muslims, right? Okay. Because India is the fatherland and holy land. And he acknowledges this as well. That includes Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, any number of other groups, Lingayats and things like that, who would, even under sort of the current legal structures in India, not regard themselves as Hindu, or who might not even be regarded as Hindu, strictly speaking, according to the law. So, for Hindutva in this case, I think what we're talking about it's a political project, and it's one that's meant to emphasize the perceived majority of people for whom there is a common core of religiously tinted kind of patriotism, in a way, basically. If you put it in terms of the RSS and the kind of the Sangh Parivar approach to this, it's about making politics more Hindu and making Hinduism more political. Okay. So I think we can set Hindutva on one side is essentially a political project, and then Hinduism itself, it's hard to define, right? There are definitions that we could go to someone like Tilak, who Savarkar himself cites, where Tilak says it means the belief in the Vedas, and beyond that there are many ways of practicing, and no strict rules in terms of no orthopraxy. So, that could be one way of trying to approach it that people have often suggested. The old Astika Nastika sort of distinction that you find in classical Hindu philosophy, but where you say, the Vedas and sort of some kind of reincarnation, rebirth, karma, that kind of notion. If you buy into those things, as the Vedas are authoritative in some sense, and from that flows the kind of Upanishadic ideas about rebirth, and then that would make you a Hindu by some definitions. The trouble with that, I think, is there are groups who don't believe in rebirth, right? There are plenty of groups throughout the history of India who people would want to probably regard as Hindu that don't, maybe they give nominal credence to the idea of that the Vedas are authoritative, but in practice, they don't really care much about that. I think that's true even of a lot of people today. I think there's a way in which Hinduism, from my point of view, as an outsider, it's very easy to say Hinduism is just whatever Hindus do. and not to get too hung up on trying to define it by any set of traits other than just sort of looking at descriptively what people actually do. But the problem with that, as I suggested earlier, is that Hindu also has this sense, is a basic kind of, you can be an atheist, non-practicing Hindu, right? You can be from a communist family and never have been to a temple a day in your life, or never have said a mantra or done any of these kinds of practices. But if your name is Radhakrishnan, then society will perceive you as Hindu, and there's no getting out of it. In the same way that if your name is Hussein, you're Muslim, and it doesn't matter if you're actually an atheist or what your personal beliefs are. So defining Hinduism, I think, is a much more complex question than defining Hindutva.
Okay.
You spoke about the Hindu identity. So I was wondering, how is it characterized? Is it based on being a non-Muslim or a non-Christian? Not being not someone else, and also how modern is the Hindu identity? Is it something evolved during the British colonial times, or was it before that? Just before that.
Right. So this too is a continuing debate, and I'm liable to run afoul of of even my own opinions here. That is to say, I'm of two minds about this, depending on how precise we want to be in what we mean by identity and how we define these things. But there are people who make the case that Hinduism, as we think of it now, Hinduism as a kind of world religion with central texts like the Vedas and the Gita, and a strong sort of emphasis on Advaita Vedanta as the kind of most prestigious philosophical school. Basically, essentially, the kinds of things that you get from someone like Vivekananda, that form of Hinduism is essentially a product of an early modern, 19th century kind of move. We find that the word Hinduism itself, with that sort of Greek suffix ism, is something that we don't actually see until the late 18th century, actually. Mm-hmm. Because why would people in India have been using words with Greek suffixes before the introduction of these languages? So that's one thing, and I think there's a case to be made for that, and to think of it in those terms, is also to say that we have to take into account the people who were the interlocutors with people like William Jones or Monir Williams, or these figures who were influential in kind of putting some of these ideas together that Ram Mohan Roy, Vivekananda, these people were responding to. So that's one thing. On the other side of it, though, there's a good case to be made from the other side that says that people had some kind of a self-understanding of Hindus as a group distinct from, a them, in this case, where the them happens to be Muslims, although they weren't necessarily usually called Muslims at the time. The text will refer to them as Turks, or that is to say, Turushka or Yavana, sort of Ionians or something like that. Occasionally you find Pathans or something as the sort of ethnic markers. Mm-hmm. But the people not so much in Sanskrit literature, but in early modern forms of Hindi and things like that there is a sense that there is an us, essentially around the time that there starts to be a them. So around the time that you find larger populations of Muslims in the subcontinent, that people begin, as you might expect, to suddenly have a sense of, okay, well, now there's some kind of a difference, where before the salient differences might have been, we're Vaishnavas and those people over there are Shakto, or we're Shrauto and those people over there are, Dalits or something, right? That those were going to be the more meaningful distinctions. Once you have a group of people professing something that is, markedly different, or that's different in ways that they would say, okay, well, actually we participate in image worship, and those people say that's not okay. Or we believe in rebirth, and those people say you only live once, and there's a judgment. So you do start to see, some clear sense during that time period. And David Lorenzen and others have written about these texts that say, once you get outside of the Sanskrit milieu, which tends to essentially ignore these things as much as it can, there's a pretty clear sense that people have a notion of Hindu. Now, how we define it and what the boundaries are around it is a little murkier. Andrew Nicholson also, there's a book called Unifying Hinduism, where he looks at this from a philosophical standpoint and says essentially that he thinks there's a proto-Hindu philosophical sort of consensus that comes in somewhere in the 15th to 16th century around figures like Vijnana Bhikshu, that, it's Vedanta and Sankhya and yoga sort of synthesized in a way, but actually, strikingly, it's actually not so much Advaita Vedanta. But so there are there are waypoints that one could easily point to before the advent of the sort of so-called colonial construction of Hinduism that seem to pretty clearly indicate that, in fact, these ideas, they didn't just spring out of nowhere. There was a development essentially from the late medieval period, and a gradual sort of coalescing of a sense of, these communities having something in common beyond the specific kind of regional formations. Okay. Now, me personally, I tend to emphasize the regional formations because, well, a bias on my part, it's a cognitive bias where I find the differences slightly more interesting often than the overarching narratives. So I tend to look at Bengal and find it more interesting when you find things like Gaudiya Vaishnava, like Chaitanya Vaishnava texts, early Chaitanya Vaishnava texts that use Hindu to talk about, they distinguish themselves from that. And so in some of these texts, they don't think of themselves, these early Vaishnava movement, Chaitanya Vaishnava movement in Bengal, they don't appear to think of themselves as Hindus, but they talk about the other groups as Hindus. And Hindus are those people over there who are essentially pushing Varnashrama Dharma, and usually they're Shakto, and so that also means they're doing sacrifices and things that we don't approve of. And so there are ways in which, if you go back, you can read against the grain in some of these cases and find uses of Hindu or even of Hindutva in some of these texts that are strikingly different from what we see now. So, modern Hindutva is very, very much less focused on things like caste than you might find in some earlier uses of the term. So, there's a text from the early 19th century, a Bengali text that I've looked at a bit that uses Hindutva, but Hindutva essentially to mean, and they gloss it themselves as essentially meaning our sort of our Jat and, Jat Dharma. So, that would be really antithetical to modern Hindutva, right? They don't want to, that would go against the whole unifying thrust of it nowadays.
Yeah. So it's like one of the questions I had was what would be like a unifying factor across the country with practices ranging from different castes and, different regions. But then, I think, as you said, it depends on region to region, right?
Yeah, I think it's what you want to emphasize and at what level, at how granular do you want to get in terms of making those emphases. This is built in too, also from an early stage. India has, for a very, very long time, for millennia, perhaps even been a very sort of self-consciously pluralistic society. So, even in the Dharma Shastras, they say, what is your dharma, right? And so dharma is probably about as close as we get to some kind of a notion of religion, and that would map in this case to something that we would think of as, anachronistically as being Hindu religion. Well, your dharma, sure, it relies on things like the Shruti and the Smriti, right? You have these sacred texts, but it also depends heavily on, what's the behavior of well-regarded people in the particular area where you live. So it depends on, where you are, framed as kind of the deshachara, right? So it's how proper people behave in the particular desh where you live. And that would be, that's a regional construct in these cases. We can see clearly by how it's applied. And then also upon one's own conscience and things like that. So even from these early stages, the writers in the Dharma Shastras were very aware of this kind of regional difference and sort of, in some ways, it's a sort of Tilak's point, understanding that there's going to be a difference in practice in different regions is arguably a defining feature.
Okay.
And maybe that's a thing that is fairly unique to or at least, if not unique, is something that the Hindu traditions make much more explicit, perhaps, than a lot of other traditions that people might be familiar with. Just to foreground that and say, well, yeah, of course it's different. What you do in Kerala is going to be different from what happens in Gujarat, and everybody knows that, and everybody's okay with that.
Okay. So does it mean that, because Hindutva has much more strict guidelines, you can say, and how is that important to distinguish between the pluralistic aspect of the traditions, the Dharmic traditions, or you can say Hinduism, with the way Hindutva wants to be perceived? Like, how do you think? Why is it important? Is it quite useful for us to distinguish so that Hindutva, as it doesn't become just a only force remaining in the country or in the regions?
Yeah, I think it's important. And again, as an outsider, but as someone who teaches about these traditions and who has many Hindu friends, I think it's important to distinguish between the sort of overt political manifestations that we have, sort of currently, as important as they are, and the traditions broadly construed. Because, lots of people who are Hindus want nothing to do with Hindutva, right? And conversely, in many ways, lots of people who are invested in Hindutva, maybe they're not so interested in what people like me would tend to think of as being the important things about Hinduism, per se.
Yeah.
So it's in the same way that I think it's important for, a lot of Christians in the United States. They don't want to be associated with the sort of right-wing, the very kind of nationalistic version of Christianity that has a very powerful voice and is very sort of politically influential here. But, that's not the only way to practice the religion. In fact, it's kind of in many ways, from my point of view, the whole point of religions is that people have kind of a grammar of so to speak, of a tradition that they can recombine in their own ways and use it to make meaning of their lives at different points. And the political version of it, is nailing some of these things down and marking off strict boundaries as a way to sort of organize people to a particular political end. And that's a very different project altogether. So I think it's very important to distinguish the two. I think also because then it allows us, as you've noted, I think that there's a tendency for people, especially on the sort of Hindutva side of the aisle, to collapse these categories and to say, well, if you criticize Hindutva, you're actually criticizing, the whole of sort of classical Indian thought. And, you must not, if you criticize, Modi, then somehow that means that you don't find, rock-cut temples beautiful or something, right? Because those were, Hindus made those. And so that sort of, there's a slippage there that I think is misleading and sort of, and that people would do well to sort of interrogate, in the same way that people, in the States would say, if you can't be a good Christian if you don't support, our particular current president. That's, of course, it's nonsense. Yeah. Lots of people of various, sort of political persuasions adhere to different religions, and you can't collapse a religion into one particular political point of view.
Okay. So another thing, like you said that kind of Hindutva is a reaction to the others, right? Like the whole identity, and also the Hindutva as a political project is also kind of a reaction to others, along with a notion of unity among people from this particular region, right? So I was wondering how much of that is leading Hindutva to go towards go become like the Abrahamic religions, like you mentioned, like how much of that is like a race towards gaining numbers, as you mentioned once.
Well, I'm not sure that it doesn't suit my own interests, I should say, to be perfectly transparent about it, to want to characterize the so-called Abrahamic traditions as either as having one particular way of dealing with these things. Mm-hmm. Judaism, for instance, has no particular demonstrated interest in converting people, and then, there are many ways in which Christians and Muslims and so forth approach these, and historically have approached these questions with very distinct points of view towards that do not fit sort of contemporary narratives. But I think for sure, the project of Hindutva as conceived by Savarkar and his sort of descendants, as it were, is one designed explicitly to sort of create a sense of a majority out of something that at the time may have seemed more fragmented. So again, not only with the sense of expanding the category of Hindus such that it would include 6 Jains, Virashaivas, and so forth and so on, Buddhists, and basically everyone that doesn't explicitly profess Christianity or Islam or something. So I think that is a clear thrust of what Savarkar had in mind, and you do see this in many ways. It's kind of built into the way that things like the census works, as I understand it, in India, which is that sort of Hindu is the default setting, right? So unless you explicitly say like, no, I'm a Parsi, or no, I'm some other, unless you mark down something else, you get sort of lumped in when people quote statistics that say things like, well, India is 80% Hindu. Well, how many of those 80% of people are, Adivasis or something who, they don't really, if you went, and hung out with them, you would not necessarily think that what they're doing is practicing Hinduism in the way that's commonly understood.
Yes. Mm.
So partially, I think it's for sure about swelling numbers, but it's also about creating a sort of a unified political consciousness. And that, as you suggest, I think explicitly with the goal in, Savarkar's early writings anyway, more explicitly with the goal of sort of opposing the British. But, as time goes by, he shifts that more to thinking about it in terms of Muslims, but as some kind of, quote unquote, foreign group who doesn't regard India as the Holy Land, and therefore somehow their fundamental sort of religious allegiance is somewhere else, whether that's in the Middle East or whether it's Rome or, whether it's Mecca or Jerusalem or Rome, and so forth. So yeah, it's explicitly a project, I think, about creating a kind of unity that can be put to political ends.
Okay. I mean, I was actually trying to compare with the Buddhism in Sri Lanka, and how they have kind of appropriated lot of castes, and kind of, and to make sure that there's a unified force against the Tamils, for example. Is it like, I was wondering if that's the future, that's the way, that's a path of Hindutva.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the present, perhaps more so than the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, in Sri Lanka, if you look at the contemporary situation, it's much less, groups like the Bodu Bara Sena and things like that, they're much less focused on, on Tamils now than Christians and Muslims, much as the situation is in India. So contemporary Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, also you see this kind of thing in Burma, very much focused on, on the Muslim populations and the Christian populations as well, where they have them more so than the issues with the Tamils, which is far from my area of expertise. But my sense of that, at least initially, was somewhat more of a ethno-linguistic kind of an issue than it was specifically built around a religious identity in the way that the current iteration of like Sinhala Buddhist nationalism is.
Yeah. So I was also going to ask you about the regressive practices in Hinduism. Again, the thing is it like for example, when you point out, or when you talk about the regressive practices in, say, Islam, or or in Christianity, you talk about, like, it's written in the scriptures. You go back to that point, that okay, the scriptures have been there, and you have to reform based on that and all. Like, do we do the similar thing in terms of Hinduism, or it's a result of different social and cultural and economic situations over the years, to deal with those regressive practices?
Well, I think two things. One, I think it is also the case despite the sort of rhetoric in Islam, perhaps, that, we can, within some sections of Islam, maybe this kind of particular one that's favored by the Saudis and things at the moment, of sort of basing allegedly everything on the Quran, or a rhetoric within certain forms of Protestant Christianity of everything's based on the Bible. What in practice people do is, of course, they interpret it according to a tradition of interpretation, and that means there's hadith and there's all kinds of jurisprudence, and these are, as soon as you get into that, you get into regional traditions. So, I mean, I'm a big proponent of the notion that actually everything is a regional tradition if you sort of zoom in on it to see what exactly people are doing. But I think there are people who have tried to do this sort of thing in some Hindu contexts. The problem is, again, which Dharma Shastra, or which sort of legal tradition do you subscribe to? Or, which sources of authority do you credit? And so I think sometimes it's textual, but, in other cases, I can think particularly of, the famous sort of widow marriage debates that happened in Bengal. Those happened also in almost the same terms. They happened back in the middle of the 18th century. And at the time, people made the same arguments, that is to say, or very similar arguments that based on Dharma Shastra to sort of make the case that it was permissible for a widow to remarry, at least under certain circumstances. And the way it seems to have been shot down was by appeal to Deshachara, to basically that the winning faction at that point, in the 18th century anyway, they said, okay, look, it's fine. You make a decent argument based on the text, but that's just not how we do things here. And at the meeting where this is alleged to have happened, the Raja who presided over it is supposed to have, driven home his point by serving mutton to the pundits who, the sort of assembled pundits there when they objected and said, what are we're not going to eat mutton. That's crazy. Like, what are you doing? And he says, well, show me in the Shastras where it says you can't eat mutton. And they say, well, it doesn't say in the Shastras you can't eat mutton. It's just, it's not done. And he says, yeah, see, it's not done. Same thing with widow remarriage. And so I think, again, we have to take into account, all of these kinds of factors that people use in justifying, whatever their social program is, without, really, I think, without getting too bogged down in a strict interpretation of what does the text say, because people will find texts that say what they want them to say. People are quite ingenious in this regard. And this is what we do as humans, is we take these resources and use them, we fit them to our current circumstances and our current agendas. So I wouldn't want to pin it on texts. Also, in the case of Hinduism and a lot of these similar traditions, there's no, you can always adduce a different text. So if you find some provision that you don't like in Manu, well, maybe there's something in the Puranas that says otherwise. Or you go to the Tantras, which many people, especially coming out of the later medieval period, also adduce as, as a form, at least of Smriti, if not Shruti. So, you can go to the Tantras and find things that will explicitly contradict what you find maybe in some of these older sources. So, with as many texts as there are available to anyone who can sort of read a bit of Sanskrit anyway, you can make really sort of whatever case one wants. And you only have to look to someone like, Ram Mohan Roy to see that kind of thing in action. He argues against many of the pieties of his time, and he backs everything up with recourse to some kind of scripture. Now, whether people, clearly a lot of the pundits at the time would contest that, but we can't blame everything on texts, and certainly people don't. Texts are just a resource, I guess, is the main thing I mean to say here.
Okay, so in a way you can agree that in a way it's a bit of both, that it's you can use your text and the social and social and political conditions to justify the regressive. Like, I was wondering whether the current regressive practices or the modern regressive practices was mainly because of economic conditions, or it's just it's both. Like what you say is it's a bit of both.
I guess what I would probably be inclined to say off my suspicion would be in most of these cases that there are particular rationales for particular practices. It wouldn't be necessarily so easy as saying, everything that is not sort of in keeping with contemporary, with sensibilities that I gather, like you and I probably share to some degree, that all of those things, have the same reasons behind them. I think there's probably, we would take it on a case-by-case basis. But in a general sense, what sort of practices do you have in mind?
Untouchability, for example, and in general, a lot of casteist practices apart from the untouchability, and then there is the whole practice of the sexist practices and all those things. Like, is it those kind of things?
Yeah, so clearly one could adduce textual support for those things if that were desired. And the converse is also true, right? There are very progressive, by sort of current thinking, very progressive standard ideas that one can also find in many Hindu texts. Sort of universal humanistic ideas are also very easy to come by. Patriarchy, I think, is, well, that's just sort of a global standard that is still that we all still reckon with to one degree or another. That is by no means unique to Hinduism. That's the world over, as far as I can tell. Some small hunter-gatherer groups notwithstanding, perhaps, but yeah, I think that stuff is there in the text, but there are voices of critique that are also there from a very early point. So I think it comes down to what one wants to emphasize. I wouldn't be in a hurry to want to say that we could blame Hinduism with a capital H for necessarily any of these things, because there have always been, so far as I can tell, or I mean, if not always, there have usually been people who would identify with these traditions and operating within these traditions who have offered critiques of them. So, I mean, there's a way in which I suspect a lot of it is just a kind of a cultural inertia, right? It's harder to change things than to let them carry on as they have been. And then especially once you have power entrenched within certain communities, they're not going to be in a hurry to give it up, even if on some level maybe they think that might be what they would like to do in a perfect circumstance, right? But am I really going to give up, sort of my own spot at university, so that it can go to a reservation for some other group, even if I think maybe that, that's what would happen in a just world. But, when it's you, then, people tend to they tend to act pretty self-interestedly. So, I mean, I would chalk these kinds of things up to sort of basic human nature and to just sort of power protecting its own interests more so than trying to pin it on the tradition as such.
Okay, and I'll go to one more question. Like, is there a caste angle to the interpretation of to the text, which are mostly in Sanskrit, right? The Hindu texts are mostly in Sanskrit. Is there a caste angle to that a certain caste, like probably Brahmins, were the one who were writing those things, and because there is because we don't see much about the Pali, I think, if I'm not wrong, the Buddhist scriptures. So is there a caste angle there?
I mean, if by caste angle do you mean are the vast majority of these texts written by Brahmin men, I think that is almost certainly the case as far as Sanskrit, at least pre-modern Sanskrit, is concerned. We can probably infer from that in most cases that's going to, by default, advance the particular sort of point of view, class interests, caste interests, etc., gendered interests of the people who are writing the texts. But it's not always the case. Even in the Upanishads, there's a lot of the Upanishads claim to be written by Kshatriyas. Specifically, there's a lot of it's framed as, this is secret knowledge that was kept among the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins didn't know it, and that's why it's just sort of coming out now. You also see in these texts, I think there's a sense in which, and Nathan McGovern has written about this a little bit, the sense of who was a Brahmin is also maybe a bit more fluid in a lot of these earlier sources as well. So we might question, as he does, what it meant to be a Brahmin at the time of the writing of the Upanishads, or in the time of the sort of early Buddhist sources, for instance, whether that was in fact something that had to do specifically with sort of your parentage, or the sort of commensality and endogamy, so the anthropological ways of talking about this, right? With whom did you eat and with whom did you intermarry? That those were the markers of who was a Brahmin. There's if you take a certain reading of these texts, there is some sense that it seems like the Buddhist texts would be very explicit about it and say, well, the one who restrains his senses and who, is always truthful and so forth and so on, that person is a Brahmin. And it would stand to reason then that if you do those things, then you're a Brahmin. And so when we think that, we should also, I suppose, ask whether those categories are as stable as what we think that they are. Nicholas Dirks has talked about this as well with regard to a lot of the caste categories, that a lot of this, it was somewhat more fluid, it seems like, in the period before, previous to the colonial period. A lot of these sort of caste categories, as we understand them now, got hardened in a way by the censuses and things like that, such that there were times when, again, I go back to the 18th century, and because it's kind of my wheelhouse, but where, a Kayast would be considered a Kshatriya in North Bengal, and a Shudra in sort of south or central sort of the Rar region. And it was a matter of sort of local custom and interpretation. And so these categories as well of caste, not to say that there haven't been pretty clearly always some people on the low end of the scale who were, systematically disadvantaged by the sort of Varnashrama system. But that for people within the system, there was certainly more. It was more fluid in some ways than what one might think, and that there was room for a kind of upward mobility. One thinks also of like the various Shudra proudly sort of Shudra kings that you find in the Deccan Plateau in the later modern period. This is a Narayana Rao and David Shulman have written about this in a book called Symbols of Substance, where they talk about these kings who are they're Shudras, and they make no attempt to present themselves as Kshatriyas, as if a classical reading of Hindu kingship would say, well, the king needs to be Kshatriya, right? We have these sort of Varna categories and strict ways that they correlate to particular roles in society. And that just hasn't always been the case. People are creative, and they work with the categories that they've got, and they rework them and reinterpret them and make lives for themselves and build traditions based on their current circumstances.
Okay, I mean, the other part, what you spoke about how it was written, but is the interpretation also, we can say that there's a caste angle, or it's, as you said, it depends on region to region, community to community.
How do you mean the interpretation in this case?
Interpretation of those texts, like all the texts you were talking about, is that also certainly like there was a certain ownership from a certain caste, or it was it was available across for interpretation? Is it?
Yeah, I think I understand what you mean. Again, it comes to part of the issue here is what do the texts represent versus what people may have done. So in a lot of these texts, you do have the sort of something that will happen in the kind of preamble that will say essentially who has the adhikara to read the text, right? What sorts of people have the right or the qualifications to read the text. And usually, again, this winds up being either limited to just Brahmins or limited to just twice-born. That is like the first three, that is the Brahmin, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas. It might say that those people are the only people who have the particular adhikara for the text. Whether that's how things actually played out is perhaps another matter, right? I mean, again, I work with a lot of sort of tantric texts, and these texts will often also say things like, well, you have to have had the sort of the diksha to read this text. But, in practice, we know that clearly that's not the case, because we see people from other traditions quoting the text that in theory they should never have read in the first place. Right. Or, personally, I do it all the time. I don't have the diksha to read these texts, right? Or I don't have the adhikara to read, a lot of these sort of, Advaita texts are also the sort of supposed to be limited to, to Brahmins and so forth. So these texts circulated in certain ways, and people, I think, would share them and interpret them in ways that the authors of the text may not have always intended. So I think, again, it comes down to how much do we think that what the texts are saying is descriptive of the way that things were, versus how much do we think what they're saying is the way that in the world of the text that they wish things were. I mean, I think that's a lot of the case when it comes to the Dharmashastras, especially. I don't think they're really describing a world wherein, if a Shudra steals a loaf of bread, he has to do a prayaschita or something, but if a Brahmin does it, he gets banished from the town forever. Right. I mean, they're probably the polities, probably didn't operate like that. It's probably the case. I mean, speculating here, right? But I'm imagining in a more a realistic situation, that this is kind of what the author of the text sort of envisions that the world should be like.
Yeah. Okay.
And in real life, that it's going to come down to, who's got the ear of the king, and like whose family is invested in what in the town. Can you really afford to banish that person or not? Right? They're going to be all kinds of, real life concerns that would get in the way, just as they do nowadays, of enforcing what would appear to be the law. I mean, imagine if you read the Constitution and thought that was how things actually worked, right? The laws are only as effective as the people who enforce them, and the people who enforce them have, relationships, local relationships, and they have their own interests. And so I think this is going to apply to the vast majority of these kinds of classical texts as well. They're an ideal, they're someone's ideal of how life should be, and not always, for better or worse, they don't always translate to how things were.
Okay. About Nathan McGovern, right? Like in his text, he talks how Brahminical traditions, talks about both the Brahminical and non-Brahminical traditions, and how Brahminical tradition was kind of a reaction to the non-Brahminical tradition, which he says Sramanic, like, and he also speaks about Buddhism, interchanging between Buddhism and Jainism, the philosophy and the way of life. That kind of like. Can you expand that? Expand a bit on that?
Yeah. So first of all, I very much would recommend his book, The Snake and the Mongoose, it's called. And he does some really interesting work also on Hinduism in Thailand for an edited journal issue that should be coming out relatively soon on Hindu-Buddhist interactions. I've been working with him and some others on. But I think his primary argument there, if I can do the crayon version of it, is sort of what I was suggesting earlier, that up through the period of the later Upanishads and early Buddhist tradition, where it seems like these were all thinkers that were part of a common milieu. It's not as if the Buddhists were in sort of one forest and the people who were working with the Upanishadic texts and composing those and things like that were somewhere else, right? They're clearly, and the Jains were somewhere else altogether, right? These people are all interacting with each other. They're debating. They're exchanging ideas. We see like clear influences back and forth. So that McGovern's suggestion is that it's not only is it not necessarily clear that there was a clear quote unquote Brahmanical tradition that was opposed to the Buddhist tradition during this point, but that gradually what we see is a consolidation during this time period, and in the early sort of Dharma Shastra works that are coming out of this time period, of the notion that a Brahmin is effectively the son or daughter of a Brahmin, that it makes it a hereditary category, as opposed to a category to which one could aspire, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of saying, the Brahmin restrains his senses and is truthful and so on, and if one does that, then you become a Brahmin, that, you have to be born a Brahmin in order for to have that. So he goes through different texts and tries to say, well, what if we don't just sort of project the categories as we know them now back onto the text? So we take the text sort of on their own terms. What it looks like is happening is that is a gradual process. And part of the way that I think he suggests that we can see that, other people have made this kind of an argument a little bit in the past, is the way in which, moksha, the liberation, gets added on to these purusharthas. So, you have these goals of human life. And in the earlier texts, the goals of human life are that you should pursue wealth and power and things like that, artha, right? You should have a job and try to provide for yourself and your family and things like that. You should pursue kama, pleasure in its various forms, aesthetic as well as sexual and other kinds of pleasure, the good things in life. And you should pursue your dharma, right? You should do your duty to your family and to society and so forth, and to the gods. So, in early texts, you have these three goals in life. And after a point, there is added to that this category of moksha, the pursuit of liberation, which was not there before. And we see also in the sense of, the sort of stages of life, right? Of the student to the householder to the sort of the vanaprastha, the retirement in the forest kind of category. To that is added this kind of ascetic fourth stage, right? So that this is, he argues, a way that, and others have suggested too, that this is a way that we can actually see a Brahmanical tradition that's sort of coalescing and trying to find ways to incorporate these Shramanical aspects into its own sort of scheme. So I think his argument is really one that is I think is pretty. It's useful, in its own terms, but also in general as a sort of a case study for always taking the time to really think about and define the terms that we're dealing with, especially when we go to sort of pre-modern sources, rather than assuming that a word means what we think it means now.
Yeah.
Just sort of go back and say, okay, well, it says, this is a thing that's restricted to Brahmins. Well, actually, who were Brahmins at this point, right? We can't just assume that Brahmins are people, named Iyer and Bhattacharya, right? That's a modern read on that. It could be the case, but, we want to look for evidence that that's in fact the case. Or see perhaps, if there's some other reading that makes more sense with the materials that we have, that we're dealing with.
Okay. One last question I have, which is, you are a scholar and academic, and you are in a times where Hindutva is the major force, in this country. And, is it challenging for you to, do your research and, to basically interact with this world, while and also being an you're not being an Indian. How does it play into the how does it play into the whole experience?
Yeah. To this point, anyway, so far, I haven't actually had. People have only ever been very sort of welcoming and helpful to me so far. I mean, you have the occasional run-in with people, but as I guess as probably you'll have noticed, and perhaps to your frustration, if so, my apologies. I tend to approach these things, because I'm an outsider, I tend to approach them from a very. I tend to be pretty hesitant to interject my own personal opinions and critiques in a lot of these circumstances. So that's one thing. That is to say, it's not my culture, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a long tradition which I would not necessarily like to be a part of white Indologists banging on about caste and things like that, and trying to adopt a morally superior standpoint to that, which I don't think is really justified, because most of those white Indologists come from places that also have, vast sort of racial stratification, and the patriarchy is, omnipresent and things like that, right? So we're not coming from a place to assume a moral high ground to criticize these things per se. And for the large part, I'm writing for an audience, or, if I'm in a classroom, I'm dealing with an audience of people who are not familiar with Indian culture and who come to it with a particular sort of baggage from these, if anything, baggage from these kind of earlier Indologists, right? Mm-hmm. So I tend to take it more as my goal to get them to open and question, and instead of to instinctively to condemn, to sort of say, okay, well, how is our society maybe also like that, and how, where are the voices of critique that we find at various points, to inculcate a particular way of thinking about these things. So on the one hand, I should say, especially in India, but in general, I try to maintain a certain kind of humility and a certain kind of, rose-colored glasses, if you will, around some of these things, to emphasize the aspects that I think are more commonly overlooked, and maybe that are perhaps more, just to complicate matters, rather than to assume a kind of moral attitude towards it in that context. But secondarily, I guess in my own research, and this is a self-criticism, I guess I should also say, I haven't run into this problem because by and large, my work has been with Bengalis in contexts where people, I don't assume that we don't all share the same political sensibilities per se, but there's a way in which, for the time being, and, may it stay so, if at all possible, Bengal hasn't yet fallen thoroughly into the kind of hardcore communalist politics, at least not in such an overt way as we find in some other places. And so I haven't had really any difficulty in terms of carrying out my own research so far. Yeah. And I'm certainly very, very glad of it. And people usually have been extremely helpful. I haven't really run into difficulties.
Thanks. I hope it's the same for you, in future also. Actually, thanks for the conversation. This was really great. A lot of things to unpack, and I hope to have you again. It was great conversation. Thanks for joining me.
Likewise, yeah. I hope it wasn't too frustrating that my answer to most everything was, well, it's complicated. You have to take it case by case. But that's I hope it's somewhat useful.
No, it's quite useful, and thanks for joining me.
That's it from this week's episode of Grasshopper in the Art. Hope to see you again next week.